After leaving Boston to escape exhaustion and loss, Nora Hale bought a rundown cabin beside Lighthouse No. 7 on the coast of Maine. All she wanted was a little piece of place to fix boats and breathe again. While clearing old wall panels on her first night, she discovered a hand-crank radio hidden behind the boards. When Nora turned the dial, a faint static filled the air followed by soft clicks. Morse code, 3 short, a pause, then 2 long. Next to the radio was an old notebook labeled Night Watch, 1944, and a warning note, beware the signals after midnight. What Nora heard afterwards changed everything. Watching Lighthouse No. 7 blaze across the dark water, its beam steady for the first time in nearly half a century. Eamon spoke slowly, his voice soft in the wind. You know, this light doesn't just belong to the sea, it belongs to memory. Nora smiled, and to those who were never named. She knelt beside the old radio, now displayed as a small memorial in the cabin's center. When she turned the dial, the faint hum filled the air again, followed by a clean, rhythmic sound, 3 short, pause, 2 long. They both stood in silence. It wasn't a warning this time, it was a greeting. The next morning, Nora received an email from the Maine Historic Preservation Society. They had seen the news and wanted to help register Breakwater Light Station as an official state heritage site. Tears blurred her vision as she read the letter, not because of the recognition but because finally, the story of the Night Watch would be written into history, not buried in rumor or fading ink. That evening, Nora stepped onto the porch with hot tea. The lighthouse flickered faintly through the fog. She whispered, "Rose, me, Helen, your light has come back, and this time we'll keep it." The wind from the ocean carried a chill, but her heart felt warm. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive through gunfire or grand speeches. It comes through light, the quiet work of ordinary hands doing something extraordinary, simply because they believe the light must never go out. Nora found a handwritten letter in the wooden mailbox outside her door one cold winter morning. The paper was yellowed, the handwriting shaky but clear. "Dear Ms. Hale, my name is Grace Kittredge, granddaughter of me, and I am the woman from the journal you discovered. My family believed she was lost in the war. We learned about you through the news of Breakwater Light. I wish to visit where my grandmother's final light once shone over the sea." Nora held the letter, her hands trembling. The name Me was no longer just part of a story. It was blood still living. 2 weeks later, Grace arrived. She was around 70, her hair silver, and she wore a thick winter coat. Her face was the face of someone who had endured much and learned to forgive. As soon as she exited the car, she looked straight toward the lighthouse. "All my life, I've heard stories about my aunt who vanished," she said softly, "but no one ever thought we'd find her here." Together they walked to the cabin. Nora opened the door, the scent of fresh wood mixed with the salt air. The old radio and the leather-bound journal lay on the table, now preserved behind glass. Grace touched the cover and tears filled her eyes. "My aunt's handwriting. My mother used to tell me how she sent signals to ships passing through the storm. They said she died that night, but no one knew the light stayed on." Nora stayed quiet, giving her space. After a while, Grace reached into her bag and took out another older notebook with pages yellowed by time. "This was my mother's. She wrote that on the night the storm warning came, Me refused to leave the post. She just said someone out there still needs the light." Nora's chest tightened. "She was right," she said softly. "That light still saved lives even 80 years later." They walked together to the shore at sunset. The air was cold, but the sky blazed red like fire. Nora carried the radio with her, turned the knob, and listened. 3 short, pause, 2 long. The two women looked at each other. Grace smiled through her tears. "She's still here." Nora nodded, not as a ghost, but as a promise kept. They stood quietly, listening to the waves and wind merge into one long song, no longer mournful but peaceful like the hum of watchkeepers long gone. That night, Nora wrote in her own journal, "When the light passes from one hand to another, the past is no longer the past. It becomes a promise." Lighthouse No. 7 blinked softly in the dark, not to warn, but to say that the keepers had come home. By the following spring, Breakwater had changed so much that its residents could hardly believe it. The old cabin beside the lighthouse had become the Night Watch House, a small exhibition room where visitors could listen to Morse signals, see photographs of the 3 women who once kept the light, and read the journal pages buried beneath the dust of time. There were no tickets, no big signs, no advertisements. Just a simple wooden plaque hanging at the gate, "We keep the light." On the opening day, Nora, Grace, and Mrs. Ruth stood side by side. Children from the town brought flowers to place around the lighthouse's base. A group of high school students read aloud from the old journal, their voices trembling. "We will keep the light burning through wind and storm, because someone out there still needs to see it." The adults stayed silent. A few quietly wiped their tears. It wasn't solemn like a memorial. It was warm, honest, and felt like a long overdue thank you. That night, after everyone had gone home, Nora stayed behind. She stepped out onto the porch, holding a cup of hot tea. Before her stretched the vast ocean, the lighthouse glowing steadily, its golden light rippling across the water. She turned the radio knob gently. A soft hum rose, then came a single signal, 3 short, pause. 2 long. This time she wasn't afraid. She smiled and whispered, "I hear you." Then she took a sheet of paper and wrote the final line in her own journal, "I came here to fix a house, but But the house ended up fixing me. Their light taught me that justice isn't just something written down, it's something remembered. A light breeze drifted by, carrying the scent of sea salt and wildflowers. In the distance, Grace waved and called out through the wind. The light's just as beautiful as that night, isn't it? Nora replied, yes, but now it doesn't just shine on the sea, it shines on people's hearts. The imaginary camera pulled back slowly, the lighthouse growing smaller against the pale violet sky. The light blinked 3 short, too long before fading gently into the night. And the narrator's voice, calm and resonant, closed the story. Their story isn't a legend, it's a reminder that true light never dies. It only waits for someone brave enough to bring it back. Nora Hale drove nearly 6 hours from Boston to the small town of Breakwater, Maine, a place so tiny everyone knew each other, and gossip traveled faster than the ocean wind. The cabin she'd bought sat about a mile from town, perched on a cliff where waves crashed against the rocks day and night. The tin roof sagged, paint peeled, the wooden door groaned, but Nora saw what others didn't: the potential to start over. She had once been a boat builder in Boston, more precisely. A woman working among men, surrounded by the constant hammering of tools and rough jokes. Her father had been a rescue diver. He used to say, as long as the lighthouse still shines, there's hope. But he died in a storm 10 years ago, and ever since, Nora couldn't hear the sound of waves without thinking of him. She came to Breakwater to breathe again, to find quiet, where no one knew her past. And no one asked why she always wore her father's silver chain around her neck. On her first day, Nora walked around town. The coffee shop owner said, "You're the lady who bought the haunted shack, right?" She laughed. "If the ghost knows how to fix boats, that's fine by me." At the gas station, a man added, "That place used to be a wartime signal post. Lights still flicker there every night like some cheap horror flick." Nora just shrugged. "I've worked in louder workshops." That afternoon, she began prying off wall panels, replacing rusty nails, checking old wiring. Behind a layer of wood, she found a paper wedged deep between the boards. The ink had faded, but the message was clear: "Beware the signals after midnight." She stopped and looked around the empty room. Outside, the waves pounded, and the wind hissed through cracks in the wall like a whisper. That night, she turned on the hand-crank radio she'd found. The first sound was a low hum, then silence. She tried again. A tiny light blinked. 3 short clicks, paused, too long. Nora caught her breath, remembering when her father had taught her Morse code as a child. 3 short, too long, enemy sighted. A warning signal. She sat still, staring out the window. Lighthouse No. 7 stood in the distance, quiet, but still shining, steady as breath. Softly, almost to herself, she whispered, "Dad, I think this place still has stories left to tell." Outside, the wind grew stronger. The light flashed 3 times, then paused, then twice again, precisely the same rhythm. The next morning, Nora woke to the smell of salt air and the cries of gulls. The old radio and the warning note she'd found the day before sat on the table. She turned the dial. Silence. No more clicks, only the wind sighs through the window frame. She brought the radio to the harbor cafe, where locals gathered every morning. When she walked in, every head turned. Breakwater was the kind of town where strangers stood out. She sat down, ordered a black coffee and a donut, then asked an older man reading his paper, "Do you know anything about Lighthouse No. 7? He looked up, eyes sharp and curious. "I used to. Name's Eamon Pike, retired Navy. Why do you ask?" Nora set the radio on the table, found this in the cabin next to it, and this note. She slid him the paper, "Beware the signals after midnight." Eamon stared at it for a long time, then nodded slowly. Back then, a group of women kept watch here. They called themselves the Night Watch. While the men were at sea during the war, they operated the radios, sending warnings about German U-boats off the coast. "Women?" Nora asked, surprised. He nodded. "Yep, believe it or not, they saved a lot of merchant ships, but after the war no one wrote their names down. Everything got buried, to avoid trouble with the military." Nora looked at the radio. "Maybe this belonged to them." Eamon shrugged. "Maybe. But be careful, miss. Some stories are best left alone. History likes to sleep." Nora walked home in silence, but those words kept echoing in her mind. The Night Watch. At home, she Googled it immediately. The first line she found read, "Women's Coastal Signal Corps, Maine, 1942-1945. Photographs appeared: women in heavy coats, standing at observation posts with binoculars and notebooks. None named me, Rose, or Helen. That evening, Nora opened the small leather journal she'd found inside the radio. The first shaky line read, "March 12, 1944, rough seas tonight, we keep the light no matter what." On the next page, a line of Morse code written in pencil. Nora whispered, "Enemy sighted." That night, when the clock struck 11:58, she heard faint clicks from the radio, very soft, like breathing. 3 short, pause, too long. She froze. Heart pounding, grabbing her flashlight, she looked out toward the sea. Lighthouse No. 7 flashed in the exact same pattern. "It can't be a coincidence," she murmured. And for the first time, Nora felt she wasn't just restoring a cabin. She was unlocking a door that had been closed for 80 years. News of an approaching nor'easter storm spread through the region 3 days later. People in Breakwater were used to storms. Nora wasn't. She stood by the window watching the sea churn, gulls scatter, and the lighthouse fade in the salt mist. She called Eamon. "Do you think I should leave?" His voice dropped. "If you're smart, yes. But if you've tangled yourself with that cabin, I'm afraid the storm might not be the only thing you'll face." Nora chuckled, half joking, half afraid. She sealed the windows, readied flashlights and water, and carried the hand-crank radio into the main room. Outside, the wind screamed through every crack, shaking the roof. At midnight, lightning split the horizon and the radio began to click. 3 short, pause, too long. She bolted upright, heart racing. No way. She whispered, the signal repeated, steady, deliberate, as if someone were trying to say something. Nora switched on the lamp and adjusted the tuner. Static filled the room, then through the noise, a raspy voice. Mayday, fishing vessel, engine out, coordinates 3 miles east of Breakwater Point. Nora froze. That wasn't an old signal. It was a distress call from someone alive. Without thinking, she grabbed her phone and called the Coast Guard. There's an emergency signal on frequency 5300, she said urgently, from a fishing boat off Breakwater. The dispatcher hesitated. Ma'am, that channel's been dead since the 1950s. It's not dead now, Nora shouted. The storm roared, thunder cracking like cannon fire. Rain lashed her porch as she ran outside, soaked to the bone, hair plastered to her face. She looked toward the lighthouse, its beam flashed 3 short, too long. She rushed back, jammed a backup battery into the radio, and yelled into the wind, if anyone out there can hear this, follow the signal, head toward the light. By morning, the news spread. A small fishing boat with 2 men aboard had been rescued. They said their engine died during the storm, and through the dark, they'd seen the lighthouse flashing, like someone was guiding us. Eamon called later that day. You did what they once did. The night watch would be proud. Nora gazed out at the calm sea. I didn't do anything new, she said softly. I just turned back on what they left behind. The light never went out, we just forgot to look. The wind settled over Breakwater, and for the first time since she arrived, Nora felt the place wasn't haunted by ghosts, but alive with courage, memory, and stories waiting to be heard. After the storm, Breakwater fell into an uncanny quiet. The sea lay flat as glass, and Lighthouse No. 7 stood firm in the sunrise as if it had never shaken. But Nora couldn't forget that night the desperate voice calling for help. The light flashing in Morse rhythm, and the fact that an 80-year-old device had just saved 2 lives. 3 days later, someone knocked on her door. It was Mrs. Ruth Kittredge, 84 years old, thin, bundled in a heavy wool sweater, leaning on a wooden cane. You're the one living in the lighthouse cabin, aren't you, she asked. Yes, Nora said. I'm trying to fix it up. Ruth nodded. I used to go there when I was a little girl. My mother was part of the night watch. Nora invited her in and poured hot tea. Ruth sat down, her eyes still bright despite her age. My mother's name was Rose. They called her the Light Keeper. Women like her watched the coast when the men went to war. They logged signals, relayed them by radio, and warned about German U-boats. No one paid them, no one knew their names. She opened her worn handbag and took out a small tin box. Inside was a military badge engraved U.S. Civilian Defense, Signal Corps, and a faded photo of 3 women standing beside the lighthouse. Rose, me, and Helen, Ruth said, her fingers trembling on the picture. 3 women who kept the light. When the war ended, they told the women to return to their kitchens, saying it was only temporary work. But my mother believed the light should never go out, someone still needed to see it. Nora looked at the photo, her throat tightening. Mrs. Ruth, I found an old journal. It's signed by me at the end. Maybe she worked with your mother. Ruth smiled softly. Me was the youngest. She died in the storm of 1944. They said a cargo ship went down, and she stayed at the lighthouse until the light went dark. My mother cried for a month. Nora clutched the journal. She'd thought she was restoring a house. Now she realized she was standing in a place that held the spirit of an entire forgotten generation. When Ruth left, Nora stood by the window, the breeze carrying the scent of salt and the hush of gentle waves. She thought of her father, Rose, and me, and the women who kept the light burning for others, even when no one remembered their names. That night, she wrote in her diary, they didn't need medals, they just needed to be seen. Maybe I came here not to fix a house, but to fix the memory of this place. Offshore, the lighthouse blinked 3 short, too long, not a warning this time, but an answer from the past. We're still here. News of the rescued fishing boat spread quickly through the town. The local paper ran the headline, Old Light Saves Lives in Storm, Breakwater Lighthouse Reborn. Nora didn't like the attention but knew this wasn't just about her. It was about them, the night watch. A week later, the town met at the city hall to discuss restoring the land around the lighthouse. When Nora arrived, the room was packed. Some faces were friendly, others skeptical. A middle-aged man, the owner of a local tourism company, stood up. That shack has no historical value, he said. We should build a seaside resort. This whole miracle light saving a boat thing was luck, not history. Nora gripped the folder, documents, photos, and the badge Ruth had given her. She stood. I'm not talking about miracles, she said firmly. I'm talking about history. I have proof that a group of women here once served in the Civilian Defense Corps. They were real watchkeepers who saved ships during the war, and their light still saves people today. A few nodded, others whispered. Eamon, sitting in the back, rose slowly on his cane. I served in the Navy, he said. I know that signal and I believe her. There were women history forgot. It's time we wrote their names back in. The room shifted. A young woman, a high school teacher, raised her hand. If this is true, my students should know this story. It's worth more than any resort. The tourism man snorted. What's next, lady? A museum in that shack? Nora stayed calm. No, I want to make a place of remembrance somewhere people can come, hear the Morse signals again and read the names of those forgotten. If we can build monuments for men who fought, then the women who kept the light deserve one of their own. Silence filled the room. Then someone clapped, then another. Moments later, the entire room was standing. The meeting ended in applause and warm handshakes. As Nora stepped outside, Eamon said quietly, "You just won a battle without firing a single shot. That's what we call American courage." She smiled, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I just thought if I didn't speak, they'd be forgotten for another generation." On her drive home, she passed the lighthouse. That night, its beam shone bright, steady, and calm, no longer flashing in Morse. Maybe finally the past had found its peace. A month after the town meeting, the land around the lighthouse was more alive than in decades. People from Breakwater began bringing wood, paint, and strings of lights to help Nora. No one gave orders. There were no work signs or official crews, just neighbors showing up quietly because they believed what she was doing was right. Every morning, Nora brought everyone hot coffee. Her hands were covered in paint, her face smudged with dust, but her eyes shone. By afternoon, children from the nearby elementary school would run to the shore carrying spray cans and paintbrushes. They covered the walls with the words, "We keep the light." That phrase spread fast online. It became a hashtag, "We keep the light," starting with a TikTok video posted by a local teacher showing her students practicing the Morse code Nora had taught them. Suddenly, the town of Breakwater was famous. Local news ran features. A state television station called it the story of the forgotten keepers. But for Nora, the fame didn't matter. What mattered was that tonight, the light truly lived again. On a crisp autumn night, she and Eamon stood side by side at the railing.